Hi, and welcome to Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. So I want to do plant diversity, or at least some plant diversity. And now, honestly, this video lecture is going to be a ridiculously brief introduction to plant diversity. So here's how I'm going to do this. Let's start with plant phylogeny. You know, the ancestors to plants are algae, like stoneworts, and they're still are living in aquatic ecosystems. Then about, beginning 475 million years ago, the very first plants began to live on land. And those were the non-vascular plants, also known as mosses or bryophytes. And there's three major divisions of those: liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, which are the bryophytes. And sometimes we call them all bryophytes loosely. And then you have what is called the vascular plants, which include ferns, conifers, and the flowering plants. And then, of course, you have the seed plants, which include the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms. I'm using all these words. So I tell you what, let's take a closer look into what these divisions are for our diversity. And what I love about showing this phylogenetic relationship is because it shows you how plants are related to each other, but it also shows key evolutionary innovations of plants over time that led to their great diversity that we see today. So let's talk about these non-vascular plants. I know, it always seems weird, like defining a group by what it's not, like vertebrates or invertebrates, vascular plants, and non-vascular plants. Non-vascular plants represent some of the most ancient lineages or groups of plants around. And in fact, they can trace their ancestry back to the first plants that ever colonized land. Now, we call them non-vascular because they don't have a vascular system. As you'll learn, they don't have any xylem or phloem. There's none of these water-conducting cells. And that limits their growth. They're small. They're, this big or so. They don't have very good roots. They don't have much for leaves. So they rely on diffusion to move materials around. And they're also limited to wetter areas, so dry out rather quickly. Now, sometime around 420 million years ago, we get what is called the first vascular plants. Now, they're called seedless vascular plants, and these are the ferns. Amongst other things, they're allies as well. So these plants don't produce seeds, they don't produce flowers, they produce spores, and lots of them. Now, ferns are vascular plants. They have leaves and they have roots. So that means they can actually have a root down into the soil, absorb water, nutrients, and minerals, and then it can get transported up to the leaves. And then as the leaves are making metabolites, like carbohydrates and other chemicals, they can then transport it back down to the roots. So these seedless vascular plants, without pollen, without seeds, without flowers, they were the first trees on the planet starting around 420 million years ago. They formed the very first forest. Now most of them are long gone, and we have very few fern trees alive today. Most ferns are actually small, and they reproduce by spores, and the male gamete is still flagellated, which means they need a wet environment so the male gamete can swim to the egg. Now, if you remember my stories of evolutionary history, you know that by the end of the Carboniferous, about 300 million years ago, the world dried out and got cooler. And that led to the evolution of seed plants. Think flowering plants and conifers. So the seed plants, this was a major evolutionary innovation over the ferns, the seedless vascular plants, because they could put the seed in a hard cover, and that would protect it from drying out. We say it protects it from desiccation. Additionally, was the evolution of pollen. Now, this was a huge step. I mean, I know we hate pollen because we're all allergic to it, right? And pollen is that yellow stuff you see all over the place. Now, our seed plants, the first one are these Gymnosperms, and the pollen grain actually holds the male gamete, okay? And it's no longer flagellated. So the very first seed plants were the Gymnosperms, starting about 300 million years ago. From 300 million years ago until about 150 million years ago, The Gymnosperms formed the dominant forest, along with some of these ancient fern trees as well. They're not the most species-rich group in the world. There's only like 600 or so species of Gymnosperms. These include pine trees, juniper trees, cypress trees, and even though that they are lacking in species diversity, they do form some of the largest forests on the planet that wrap around the entire globe and the northern reaches. So all the northern boreal forest and taiga, those are made up of conifers. And then about 135 million years ago, now this date is constantly getting pushed back as we get more fossils, we see the Angiosperms. And these are the flowering plants. Now flowering plants by far make up the majority of all plants. There's about 300,000 species or so of plants. There is about 280,000 species of angiosperms. Yeah, so they're really diverse. And I think I said they evolved about 145 million years ago. Yeah, they keep changing the dates on these. With angiosperms being so diverse, there's basically no way that I can cover all of them. So let's take a quick look at some broad divisions here. One is called a monocot. Now, mono just means one. Cot means cotyledon. So when these plants first germinate, and that first little thing that pop out of the soil, and look at the sun, it looks green. They look kind of like a leaf, but they're not really a true leaf. They're called a cotyledon. So a monocot, think like grasses, lilies, irises, orchids, sedges. Those are monocot. When they first germinate, there's one of those cotyledons. Then there's the dicots. Di means two, right? Two cotyledons. And in fact, we call them the eudicots. Now, there's also some differences between the eucots and the dicots. So eucots include things like sunflowers, right, which are really abundant. Rose bushes, right? These are the eudicots. Many of our flowers are actually these eudicots. And there are some other differences between the monocots and dicots in terms of how they hold their vascular bundles and the veination in the leaves and in the petal patterns of the flowers as well. And that's something that I'll get into more in a later lecture. Now here's some different types of diversity that's not necessarily evolutionary related. Now some trees are deciduous. Deciduous trees lose their leaves. And evergreen trees, they keep their leaves all year long. So the vast majority of our conifers, like pine trees, and fir trees, like Douglas firs and Christmas trees, right? They're evergreen. They keep their needles or their leaves all year long. A deciduous tree, like the quake and aspen, and a lot of oak trees, not live oaks, but a lot of the other oak trees and aspen trees, they will lose their leaves in the wintertime and enter a state of dormancy. At least that's how they do it up here in the temperate regions of the world. There are some places in the tropics that get really dry throughout the year. And you'll see these deciduous tropical forests. It's really wild. You know, in the rainy season, they look like a full-on tropical forest. And then in the dry season, they look like a temperate forest. They've lost all their leaves, but it's still hot outside. Pretty crazy. But this deciduous versus evergreen, this is not necessarily a phylogenetic relationship, just a habit of the plants to adapt into either cold environments or environments that have a very wet versus a very dry season. Now, plants are found in a great many different habitats. And as a result of being found in so many different habitats, guess what? There's a lot of diversity. So if you go to a desert, you'll find plants that store water. So you might find succulents where they're storing water in the leaves, or you get something like these stone crops. They're in the middle of the picture there. I know, they look like little stones, hence the name stone crop. Lithops. Litho means rock. So they're plants that look like rocks. You might see cactus. In this case, the stems are holding all the water, and the leaves have been reduced to thorns. And another adaptation for living in a desert is small leaves, like this cat claw on the right. You see the leaves are very small to prevent desiccation, or I should just say to prevent water loss. Desiccation just means you're losing water, you're drying out. And speaking of desiccation, the exact opposite of a desert is a rainforest. lots of rain, lots of water, lots of humidity, no chance of drying out. And here the plants grow very rapidly. The leaves are large. And in fact, the leaves are actually adapted to shedding water off of them because there's so much of it. And in a rainforest, you might have continuous growth all year long. And as a result, these are some of the most diverse habitats on the planet in terms of the number of species you find. So they're incredibly species rich. And this is from a place called Cerodontis in Costa Rica. You also have grasslands. Grasslands can be tropical, and we'd call those a savanna, or they can be temperate, and we would just call those a temperate grassland. They are both dominated by fire. They are both dominated by many different types of grasses, and they often depend on disturbance like, fire and grazing to maintain them. So these are adapted to very big seasonal changes in climate, which includes both temperature and rainfall, and also in disturbance as well. Plants are also found throughout the north and in high elevations, and these are our northern coniferous forests dominated by pine trees and fir trees. And the picture on the right is one of my favorite places. I'm not going to say where it's at. I don't want people going there. And then the picture on the left, that's from Colorado, for some of you who will recognize that very prominent structure in the background. But we have these plants, and these plants, they don't grow as fast, but they can live for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they may keep their needles for 30 years at times. And they do that because, they only have a very small growing season. And you know what? You can also find plants growing in water, in aquatic habitats. The picture on the left, that's seagrass. It's called Thalassia testudine, turtle. That's turtle grass. Or you can have, in freshwater ecosystems, you can have plants growing on the surface of the water, or you can have plants actually growing in the water. That's hydrilla. Now it's growing at Wakulla Springs State Park, and it was actually an invasive species. So you start to get the idea that plants can be found in a great many places. So there's a lot of diversity. And there's some really interesting plants. Now I'm going to apologize because this is going to be short and a little shallow here. I didn't have access to internet. I know. I live way out in the middle of nowhere, and internet, I have to drive to town to upload my videos. But here's some interesting plants. We have a fascination for biggest, fastest, smallest, most deadly. Well, here's the smallest one, duckweed. It's tiny. It's a very tiny little plant. Just a leaf with a little root, and it floats on top of the water. That is the smallest flowering plant in the world. I know, it's hard to believe that it actually has a plant, that it actually makes a flower. At the exact opposite end, here's a sequoia. These things are enormous. This is from Sequoia National Park. You can see me looking up, it's enormous. And there's General Sherman, the largest tree we know about. It's got the mass of 24 blue whales, or 40,000 people. That's bigger than all of the University of New Mexico, right? That's as big as a big university. There's me in front of it taking a selfie. I was doing selfies, and I'm not even a millennial. I'm before you guys. I'm a Gen Xer. And, I was walking along in this forest, right? And I just kept thinking I was on the planet Kashyyyk, and there should be some Wookiees, around. How cool would that be? And, of course, Return of the Jedi was filmed around the redwoods, which are very close in size to the sequoias. Gymnosperms are pretty cool, right? Not only are they the largest trees in the world, they're some of the oldest. This is not the oldest tree in the world. This is just a bristlecone pine, which are amongst the oldest types of trees in the world. And then here's a good one for you. Carnivorous plants. We always say that plants are autotrophs. They're self-feeding. They do photosynthesis, and they can make all of the organic molecules they ever need. Well, you get at plants in areas that don't have a lot of nutrients, like the southeast. We get all these, coastal plains where the soils get very acidic, they get very nutrient poor. So carnivory has evolved probably like 20 times in the southeast. And in Florida, we're a hotbed of diversity for carnivorous plants. So the one on the left is a sundew plant. And it's got those sticky little trichomes sticking out of there that will catch an insect. The other one is a pitcher plant, where the insect falls in there and gets digested in the bottom of the pitcher. And then the other one on the right is related to the one on the left, and that's another type of sundew plant. And it's like this big. So it catches very small insects. Okay, there are many other examples of very cool plants out there. And, I just wish I had more time to go into that. But like I said, this is a very brief introduction to plant diversity. And now that I've hopefully gotten everybody interested in plants, at least a little bit, just a little bit maybe, now we can move into the actual form and function and start talking about how plants work. Okay, so stay tuned for my next series of lectures on plant form and function.